please give a warm welcome to the host of Broadway Buzz, Mr. Joe Gary.
Thank you very much, and welcome to Broadway Buzz, and welcome to the Whiz. You know, the Whiz opened 48 years ago in Baltimore, and it did not have an auspicious opening. The show wasn't yet together. I mean, keep in mind, it was meant to be a groundbreaking show. I mean, the idea of having a full black cast performing in a black idiom was really extraordinary. And it deserved to have success, but it started off in a very difficult way. I mean, historically, we had several Broadway shows that used black casts. David Merrick did a brilliant Hello, Dolly, as you remember, with Pearl Bailey. And that would set the groundwork to producers thinking, we really should find a black audience, and we really should find a way of creating vehicles for brilliant black artists. And so we remember in our history, we had Porgy and Bess, we had the Black Mikado, we had Carmen Jones, but very few examples of black artists performing on Broadway. So there were very high stakes for this show. And when it opened in Baltimore, they had to fire the director and reconsider the show, reshape the show in a very short period of time. It didn't do extremely well on the road. Again, it was hard to find black audiences to come and support it. And when it opened on Broadway, on opening night, the producers met to see if they should close the show. Now, I have to tell you, when you see this show tonight, you're going to be so grateful to those producers for not closing that show. Well, what happened was 20th Century Fox had been the major investor in the show, and they came up with an extra $100,000 to try and save the show. And what they did was they put all of the money into television advertising. It would be one of the first times that a show would be heavily promoted in advertising, you know, right before the 6 o'clock news, right before the 11 o'clock news, et cetera. And it generated a very big response. And of course, the show had such brilliant music. And they used, you know, the great song, Ease On Down the Road, as the background. And the visuals for the show were so stunning that it sold the show. It would win 7 Tony Awards, which it deserved. It would play on Broadway for 4 years, but you think about that fatal night on opening night when they could have closed that show. And I have to tell you, when you see this show tonight, I can't remember being in an audience at Playhouse Square where there was such a wild, visceral response. I mean, there are so many show-stopping numbers in this show. Charlie Smalls wrote an extraordinary score with countless show-stopping numbers, and so the audience just goes crazy with the show right from the very beginning. And I promise you that by the time you leave, you have to look at yourself in the mirror to make sure you're really not 10 years old. I mean, it's an amazing experience. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning of all this and how did this happen? And of course, we have to talk about L. Frank Baum. L. Frank Baum, of course, was the author of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, The Wonderful World of the Wizard of Oz. That was the original title, shortened to The Wizard of Oz. And he was an extraordinary man. He was one of 9 children. He was the 7th child. His father was very wealthy. They lived in an estate outside of Syracuse, New York, called Roselawn. And when you're a child and you're the 7th child in a huge family, you have to do something to, you know, make yourself known. And what happened with this young man, he had a severe heart condition, and so he was fragile really all of his life, and he was homeschooled, and he would read, Dickens and Thackeray, but he learned very early on that in order to have a place in the family, he had to excel in something. And what he learned his special gift was storytelling. And so he would gather all of his siblings, and from the very early age, he would invent fascinating characters and fascinating tales and beguile the family. Everything they did in the family, he would influence. Even the decorating of a Christmas tree. He would make his father surround the tree with sheets, and he would be behind the tree decorating it, telling the family Christmas stories, and then suddenly the tree would be revealed. So from this early age, he had this very strong sense of theatricality. He started writing plays, and his father then bought him a printing press. And he and his brother created a newspaper called Rose Lawn Gazette, and they sold the paper to family members. I mean, keep in mind, it's a big family, so he sells a lot of papers that way. And then he took out local ads from merchants, and the merchants felt obligated because the family was so wealthy and helped to support the town that they felt obligated to, buy space in this newspaper. So this sense of writing was always with this young man. Tragically, at one point, his father felt that he was too protected and too isolated, and he sent him to a military academy in Peaksville, New York. I want to remind you that in that town, there is a yellow brick road. What I want you to start seeing is young Frank would pick up ideas from very early in life, store them, create stories, and ultimately they would all come together in The Wizard of Oz. Okay, so in those 2 years he spent at the military academy, it was brutal for this young, fragile, vulnerable, sensitive boy. And so he had a sort of psychosomatic heart attack and was sent home. And then he really started seriously writing plays. And he couldn't get into the theater group in town, so his father built him his own theater. That's always nice to have a rich father. In any case, what I want you to see about Frank Baum, all of his life, he had both great success and great failure. He never was afraid to fail. In any case, at the little theater, he wrote a play called Matches, and it played very successfully in the theater until the theater burned down. What a perfect title for a charred theater, Matches. He then decided that the theater was a bigger world, and so he wrote a play called The Maid of Erin, which ultimately found its way to Broadway. It toured America, and it found its way to Broadway, and he appeared in it. So he reinvented himself as a playwright, he reinvented himself as an actor, and then that show closed. He married, and he took his young wife to South Dakota. And they would open a store there called Baum's Bazaar, and they sold goods, but no one bought any. No one had any money in that period to buy anything. So he decided, being the really bad businessman that he was, he would offer free credit. So the store emptied out of supplies because everybody had unlimited credit. And of course, it went bankrupt. And then he opened a newspaper in South Dakota that also went bankrupt. It was at the period when Sitting Bull was killed at the Battle of Wounded Knee, and he wrote this devastating editorial saying that all Indians should be exterminated. I mean, it would be an article that would live with him all of his life, and his family would, apologize to Native Americans literally right up to the present. So in any case, they finally left South Dakota. They went to, by this point, he has 4 young boys, and they moved to Chicago, where he works as a journalist. But of course, having this very special gift of storytelling, his articles were not always accurate. He could make the story better by tweaking it here or tweaking it there. And of course, this is not journalism, so he was fired from the newspaper. He then took a job as a traveling salesman, and he had a lot of time on the road to work on the essence of his being, storytelling. So all the while he was away from home, he desperately missed his wife and his 4 children, and he would spend all of the time, even though he was a terrible salesman, he'd spend all of his time creating stories so that when he got home, he could beguile his whole family, as he always had with his storytelling. His mother-in-law, who was this very powerful woman, she was a feminist, and quite famous in her day, and she would have a very profound effect on young Frank. She would become the character Auntie M in, of course, The Wizard of Oz. In any case, she said to him, you know, I'm going to help you subsidize a year of your time, write some works, because you're not doing what you should be doing. You should be writing. And so he took Mother Goose's fairy tales, which were done in poetry, and he wrote them as prose in 1898, and the book became a bestseller. The next year he wrote Father Goose in prose, but this time he hired this wonderful illustrator, W. Denslow, who would change his life with the next book he would write, which would be, of course, The Wizard of Oz. So that book was an enormous success. So in the year 1900, he and W. Denslow would create the wonderful Wizard of Oz. It included so many elements of his life. As I said, his mother-in-law was Auntie M. In their family life, there was a young niece who was named Dorothy, who tragically died at a very young age, and he would immortalize her as Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. The idea of the scarecrow was always with Frank. As a boy, he used to have nightmares about scarecrows chasing him. And so that would become a central figure in the story. When he was on the road traveling, he wrote a book about window displays. And it was called The Show Window. And it was used for many years, right up to the 1940s, as a sort of aesthetic guideline for how department stores should decorate their windows, especially for Christmas. He was very beguiled with the idea of mechanized figures. And so he would take pots and pans and create figures, which would ultimately become the Tin Man, for his window displays and for the photographs he used in his magazine about window displays. So these forces would move into the story that we know. The Chicago World's Fair had the Great White City, and of course he would create the Great Emerald City in The Wizard of Oz. And the home for the wizard, the castle for the wizard, was based literally on a real castle in Michigan. It was called Castle Park, and it would be the basis for the home for the Wizard of Oz. But the most important thing for you to know, and it's very rarely written about, but one of the things that makes this work so universal and lets us go to the theater tonight as adults and watch a story that was written for children and have it reach us on the deepest level. And it's because he embedded in this story a philosophy that very profoundly influenced him. It was called theosophy. His mother-in-law introduced him to theosophy. It was developed in about 1898 and became very popular at the turn of the century. And it was sort of an aesthetic philosophy. It used all of the teachings of religions, the Christian religion, the Muslim religion, the Buddhist religion, the Hindu religion, but they didn't deal with the issues as religious issues. They dealt with these as philosophies and as a way of life. And Frank was very profoundly influenced, and it would be seriously embedded in The Wizard of Oz, in the notion of Buddhism. keep in mind in Buddhism, I mean, again, the story that we see is about Emily being displaced, moving from Kansas and her family to this magical place called Oz. I want you to know, incidentally, that the title Oz came in a very interesting way. He kept sitting in his office as he was writing this, and he kept saying, what am I going to call this? What is the name of this place? And he kept staring at his file cabinet, and the particular file cabinet he was looking at said O through Z, therefore Oz. And he used that. So I just want you to be aware that his whole life is used. And the whole real story of The Wizard of Oz is about love of family and returning to family. And that's something that Frank always felt profoundly about, that Rose Lawn of his childhood would always beckon him to come back to that magical world where he was protected by his family. But in the case of Buddhism, you remember Buddhism on that journey to enlightenment, which is the journey that Dorothy takes, of course. On that journey, they take it on the golden path, therefore the yellow brick road. Watch how brilliantly, in this version, incidentally, that the road is created. It's created by dancers, and it's really wonderful and works very well. But we understand that what this story is putting Dorothy in an alternate world. Again, Buddhism always believed that there are layers of reality and layers of truth. And even though Dorothy lived in Kansas, she could experience life in Oz, that there are planes of being. We might call it our imagination, but in any case, the Buddhists profoundly believed in this. And so this is what Dorothy does. She goes on the path of enlightenment. At the beginning of the story, watch the beautiful opening scene in the musical when she's with Auntie M just before the tornado comes. And she talks about the idea of the fact that her mother and father have died, that she's missing them terribly, that she's displaced by having to live in Kansas with her aunt. She doesn't have any friends, and she doesn't really realize the beauty that she has in the love that Auntie M is giving her. But when she goes on this journey, she will discover it. And so, of course, the Buddhists always believe in self-discovery. So watch what happens in this show, how brilliantly this is laid out. She meets the Scarecrow, she meets the Tin Man, she meets the Lion, she creates a group of friends. She has a tribe, and they're all on a common journey to find the wizard who is going to give them their wishes. One wants a heart, one wants a brain, one wants courage, and Dorothy wants to go home. That's what the story is about. But of course, what we learn by watching this, and this is not a spoiler, we all know this story, we know that they all discover that they find the answers in themselves. This is so much a part of Buddhist philosophy. And so, Frank Baum has taken this wonderful children's story that's filled with so much magic, and he's given it this very philosophic basis that makes all of us, we sit in this audience tonight and tears run down our face because by the time we hear the song Home, we clearly understand the power of home and the power of family. So it's a stunning, series of journeys that take place, and it's wonderfully manifested in this show. Okay, so in the case of what would happen then to Frank Baum is the novel would transform his life. He would ultimately write 14 more Oz stories. Almost every other work he tried to write failed. He would write 40 novels. He would write 80 short stories. He would write 200 poems. He would write 40 scripts for stage and film. and most of them failed. So again, while we have this incredible success, he's revered all over the world as the greatest children's writer of the early 20th century, but at the same time, everything else fails in his life. However, right after he opened The Wizard of Oz and it was published, he then decided it should be a musical on Broadway. And so 2 years later, in 1902, he would write a musical version of The Wizard of Oz, which was a great hit, which would play on and off for 6 years. As you know, in New York at that time, if a show ran for 2 or 3 months, that was a long run. So it had a very long run. It toured America several times, but it would always go back to New York for Christmas or Easter or special holidays. So it became a fixture in New York for 6 years and was enormously successful. After that, he would move to Hollywood, where he and his wife would buy a home based on the money that they received from the death of his mother-in-law, and it was called Oscott. And it was a luxurious home in Beverly Hills. And Frank immediately started to become a master gardener, which he wrote about. And again, success, failure. So at this point, he has an enormous amount of money coming in. He has a beautiful estate that's paid for. And then he takes all of the money that he has and invests it in silent films, which are an enormous failure for him, and he loses everything and files bankruptcy. But of course, there's so much money coming in from the residuals from the book that they're able to, refresh themselves financially. But again, this is a very tormented life. Great success, great failure, all happening at the same time. He would write a silent film called The Patchwork Girl from Oz, an enormous failure, and it closed. He would die then in 1919. But of course, his widow would live in that house till the 1950s, and she would see the other phenomenal successes that his work would have. So of course, we now come, keep in mind, after his death, his publishers hired a woman to write a book every year, an Oz book. So for 20 years at Christmas, there would be a new Oz book to be seen and to own. And so ultimately, we have this collection of almost 40 books on the world of Oz. It was an incredible franchise. But then what would happen in 1939 would, of course, change everything. And that is the creation of the world's most famous movie, The Wizard of Oz. And it was done as a musical. There are several things I want you to know about it. There are wonderful documentaries about the 50th anniversary of The Wizard of Oz. I didn't watch any of those because I like to do my own research, but I do have to tell you, the night before I started Buzz, I did watch that video, and it reaffirmed many of the stories I had gathered along the way. But there is one set of stories I'd like to share with you. As you remember, the music from the film is iconic, and Somewhere Over the Rainbow is the most successful song written for a film ever, and it is one of the most beloved songs in the world. It would be Judy Garland's trademark song, of course. It was written by Harold Arlen and Yip Harburg. Yip Harburg wrote the lyrics. I lived in New York at one point when I was doing Irish Rascal, and I lived in the same building as Yip Harburg, and he knew I worked in the theater. We met in the elevator, and he said, "Okay, young man, you can talk to me about anything about my life in the theater, but I don't ever want to talk about The Wizard of Oz, and certainly not about Somewhere Over the Rainbow." And I said, "Well, I promise, sir, I will never do that." So every time I met him, that's all he talked about, of course. And the greatest story he told me, and I never knew if it was true or not, but he said, until I watched the documentary the night before the show that we started my lectures. But in the elevator, he said to me, you can't believe this, but when they first previewed and they were testing The Wizard of Oz, it was too long, so they made very serious cuts in it, and they cut Somewhere Over the Rainbow. Can you imagine that? And the executive said, "It's very undignified for our young starlet, Judy Garland, to sing a song in a barnyard." Hollywood logic, you know. But in any case, obviously, Yip Harburg had a nervous breakdown and threatened to sue everyone, and they put it back into the work. And I did see in the documentary that was absolutely true. And Yip Harburg also talked about the tremendous chaos that existed in the making of this movie. And aside from his writing the lyrics, he did, in fact, help to write and reshape a lot of the dialogue in it. So it was a very happy meeting on my part. The other story I want to tell you about The Wizard of Oz is, of course, about Margaret Hamilton, who is the Wicked Witch of the West, the most famous character in the movie. As many of you know, she had very strong connections to Cleveland. And in the 1970s, she would come back to work at the Cleveland Playhouse. And she often stayed in my house. And I had a house on the lake overlooking the city and the lake. And it was a big house, so she could stay there nicely. And one time, she had a house in Maine and wasn't able to go because she was here for the fall and missing her life in Maine. So I said, I'm going to throw you a big clam bake. And so I invited 20 friends to come. And one of my friends came, who was a very distinguished person in Cleveland. But he came and acted like he was 10 years old with no manners. And he just followed Maggie Hamilton around everywhere. I mean, he wouldn't let her go. I mean, he was just obsessed and asked her every imaginable question he could think of about the making of The Wizard of Oz. And she was very polite and answered his questions. But they were out on this deck I had overlooking the lake. And he said, Maggie, cackle for me. And so she cackled, and I swear this is true. There was a bolt of lightning and a downpour. That's absolutely true. I didn't make that up. And what happened, I was cooking the clam bake outside on big fires. It put out all the fires. So I had to take the clam bake to all the neighbors' houses saying, can you cook this on the stove? And we finally had our dinner. So, and the other thing is, this man had his picture taken with Maggie, and he put it in his new house that he had. And when his father came to see the house, he said, well, how do you like the house? And the father said, well, I guess it's nice, but you know, you don't have one picture of your mother in this house, but you have a picture of you and Mamie Eisenhower. So I told that to Maggie Hamilton, and the whole rest of her life she kept saying, I kept asking my agent to find a movie based on Mamie Eisenhower's life, because she was having trouble finding important work at the end of her life. So I love that story. Okay, so in the final notion then, after the movie happens and it's this great success, I want you to know a couple of things. One, when the movie opened, it did not make money in 1939. It was not until the releases happened in 1949 that it started making money. And then in 1959, it was sold to television, where it would become the most watched movie in the world, and a huge fortune was made. Keep in mind, no one in that movie got a percentage of the film. Everyone got a flat salary for that, and everyone, of course, today, you know, you make hundreds of millions of dollars in residuals from it. So that's the story of The Wizard of Oz. But to go to The Wiz for a minute, when The Wiz opened on Broadway in New York in 1975, and it finally turned around and became a great success that it should have been, you know, it made great stars of the original cast. And Andre de Shield played the Whiz in it, and that was really the beginning of a very long and distinguished career he would have. In any case, the things I want you to remember: when a black audience came to Broadway to see this show, and The Wiz was done in a black idiom with very strong black speech and all black characters, and gospel music was so profoundly important in the telling of the story, they saw the story differently. And for example, when the Wicked Witch, in that scene in the second act, when the Wicked Witch turns everyone into slaves, of course, the black audience saw that in a very serious and very different way. They also saw, you know, that journey that Dorothy takes as part of the Great Migration that was part of black history. Remember, at the end of the Civil War, when all the blacks wanted to move north, they wanted to move to New York, they literally went on the roads and sang spirituals till they got to New York City, penniless. to start their new lives. So they saw this story in a very special way and in a very powerful way. And then, of course, with all the gospel music that's in the Whiz, you know, black audiences grew up in black churches where everyone sang, you know, from the bottom of their hearts. And so they could relate to this show in a very powerful way. Okay, so I was in New York doing Irish Rascal at the time. I stayed in an insane apartment on the Upper West Side, on Central Park West, a very expensive address. Very fancy people lived in that building. But John Michael Tebelak, who created Godspell, bought this apartment for his parents, and I was very close to the family, and they let me live in their dining room. And it was a huge dining room. But their niece also was there, and she would get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and come and tap dance on the dining room table. And so one night she did this wearing her little feather boa, and I said, "Abby, you're waking me up. I have to go to the theater tomorrow." And she said, "But Jojo, I want you to know the Whiz is in the kitchen." And so I went, "Oh, please, give me a break." So she got me out of bed. I went into the kitchen, and there was Andre DeShield, who was the hit of Broadway, in a gold lame jumpsuit with platform shoes. And he was there because John Michael said, "If you need to do your laundry, come to my mother's house." And he was there. So I met the Whiz, the most sought-after star of Broadway, doing his laundry outside of my bedroom. So with that, I do want you to know, and every time in my life when something crazy happens in my life, I say to myself, the Whiz is in the kitchen. And so for tonight, I know you will be easing on down the road. Thank you.